Well, I think, first of all, we can do exactly the same thing that carpenters and chemists and anyone else can do, namely educate ourselves, others, organize, take part in or initiate activism of various sorts. All of that's open to us. People who are called intellectuals are a very curious class, if you think about them. So take where I teach, MIT. If there's a Nobel laureate in physics who's working 70 hours a week in his laboratory on problems of advanced physics, we don't call him an intellectual. If the janitor who cleans his room happens to have a great deal of knowledge about world affairs and a good deal of insight into human life and understanding, maybe more so than the people who write books, we don't call him an intellectual. Intellectuals are people who have a certain degree of privilege, enough to be able to reach audiences and who discuss issues of general public interest. So yes, they have, given the privilege and the opportunities, they, of course, have greater responsibilities. Privilege confers responsibility. So they can do what the janitor can do, or what the carpenter can do, or what the chemist can do, and have other opportunities too if they use them, if we want to use them. I don't think there's any shortage of opportunity. I think there are shortages of will. In fact, if you look at the history of intellectuals, it's not a pretty one. Overwhelmingly, intellectuals have labored in the service of power. The term intellectual entered modern Western usage with the Dreyfus Arts. And nowadays we respect and honor the Dreyfus Arts, the defenders of Dreyfus, critics of the French state. It certainly wasn't true at the time. They were bitterly condemned. The leading, most prominent intellectuals had denounced them, berated them for daring to criticize state power and the Holy Army, and what right did these writers, painters, and so on have to talk about things they knew nothing about. The respected intellectuals, the immortals of the Académie Française, were bitterly hostile to the Dreyfus Arts. In fact, Émile Zola, the leading one, had to flee France. That's typically the pattern. And it goes back in history as far as you like. I mean, back to the earliest recorded history, there were people who were approximately what we would call intellectuals today. So in classical Greece, one of them was forced to drink the hemlock because he was corrupting the youth of Athens by asking embarrassing questions and challenging doctrine and dogma. Around the same time in the biblical record, there were people who were basically intellectuals. They're called prophets, but that's just a bad translation of a pretty obscure Hebrew word. They were people who criticized the crimes of the king, called for mercy and compassion for the poor and deprived, presented geopolitical analysis, warned of the threats that the evil kings were bringing to the people. So that's intellectuals. Now, what happened to them? They were imprisoned, they were driven into the desert, they were condemned. Later, centuries later, they were honored, not at the time. There were intellectuals who were honored, the flatterers at the court. Centuries later, they were called false prophets. That's pretty much the pattern. So, for example, in the West, Czech dissidents were honored, not at home, not by the ruling authorities. And conversely, intellectuals in the American domains were not only not honored, they were murdered straight out. So, for example, in a week after the fall of the Berlin Wall, in the country that was the leading recipient of U.S. military aid, aside from Israel and Egypt, a separate category, and had the worst human rights record. That's a standard correlation. El Salvador, the High Command, which is in close contact with the American Embassy, ordered a battalion of troops to invade the university and murder 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, blow their brains out, and kill any witnesses who happened to be around. So they also killed their housekeeper and daughter. I doubt if any of you could know their names, even. But if anything like that had happened in Czechoslovakia, say, probably had a nuclear war, we'd certainly have blaring headlines about it, and you'd know their names. But that's the difference. In your own crimes, you ignore. The crimes of your enemies, you love and you admire, and you praise the dissidents to the skies. That's the pattern right through history. Intellectuals don't have to do that, as the fringe of dissidents illustrates, but that's typically what they do. But apart from that, they have what they can do is what anyone else can do, and more, given the relative privilege that they have.